Yeah, the new season of Marvel Snap cards has been officially revealed. So we're going to take a look at all these final stats and effects, and we're going to talk about how good they are, and we're going to rate them each from 1 to 4 stars, seeing which of these cards look like they might be the scariest and craziest and most broken of the entire month. On that note, actually, we're going to go ahead and kick things off here with the new season pass card, Viv Vision. And Viv is a 3/2 that reads, at the start of each turn, give all cards in your hand +1 power if you're winning here. Otherwise, move this to another location. Now, when we first saw this in the data mines, this card was crazy, just obscenely broken. I was talking about how I thought it was just absurdly unfair, and it's actually gotten a couple changes since then. Number one, it actually just got a power nerf. It's now only 2 power, but it also used to read at the end of each turn, which that gave this kind of ability like a 2-for-1 punch, basically, where not only would it be useful to potentially reposition turn after turn, moving her around, creating some unpredictability, but also giving you new spots to potentially win if she wasn't winning, and thereby continuing her effect turn after turn. But it also gave you this end of turn utility where like she would actually kind of move to try to win you a game in some cases. Like, this spot's already lost, I'm going to move elsewhere. And that just seemed completely crazy to me. They've removed that. They've made her start of turn now as opposed to end of turn, which reduces that kind of, soft Captain Marvel style effect. Despite all that, to get to the point here, I still think this card's kind of crazy. Like, I still think this has a ton of potential, because effectively this can just be +3 power to your entire hand, because you play this on turn 3. So the first tick is going to happen start of turn 4, start of turn 5, start of turn 6. +3 power to your entire hand would be just completely bonkers, right? That's crazy. That's good in like any kind of deck that can keep winning the Viv Vision location. Especially good in any kind of deck that can scale with buff cards. We've seen a handful of different decks really do that successfully lately. All those classic buff multiplier cards, Bastion, Shaw, and so on. Those all play really nicely with Viv Vision, but again, you don't even have to have those. Any deck's going to value that much of a power buff. And we've also already seen and proven that it is pretty easy in some cases to kind of get ahead in a location and maintain that advantage, as we've seen with Galactus First Steps. So, if you play the kind of Hydra Bob or Black Cat package, or you just get one of those really strong 1-drops down, you play that over in the right spot. Even though Viv Vision herself is only 2 power, like, if you hit a good 1 into a good 2, you're definitely going to win once. That already makes this equivalent to like a Nakia right off the bat. And then, you might be so far ahead, the opponent's like, God, I can't even flip it the next turn, because I might only have like 1 card. I might need to play some synergy thing. Oh, I got to play my Wong. I can't contest Viv Vision, right? Because you're basically on turn 4 at that stage. So they might give it up again. I think it's very easy actually to get to 2 buffs on this. The third buff might sometimes demand a little bit more commitment, or if the opponent really goes hard. But even that has this kind of passive benefit of making the opponent overcommit in some cases, or make plays they don't really want to play because they're just so focused on Viv Vision. So I think this is very often just going to read +2 to hand without a ton of work, or without really even sacrificing your deck structure in many ways. Just getting that early positional advantage in a random little location or whatever, and just, going from there. Now, if you do start losing and she starts moving, that can backfire, because like if she moves into a spot like you haven't developed enough or whatever, it might be hard to get her going again. So this is kind of a momentum card in many cases, like maintain that momentum. But that movement still has upsides. Let's not forget, there will be instances where like you can use her to move into Sanctum Sanctorum or whatever that's closed off otherwise, and she's just going to also win you a location for free because she has this kind of little bonus utility. So I think a card you can lean into really hard and get some crazy buffs that can be magnified in certain decks to an even crazier level. But at the same time, this little mix of utility and maybe just being a Nakia sometimes might be enough to actually make this card good at a base level. So this went from like, 8-star card to what is still, I think, ultimately going to be a 4-star card and going to be very good in a variety of different decks. All right, so moving on here to Sparky. This is the super premium pass card, but there's also a change this month that you can now get the super premium pass card with series 5 packs on day one. So it's no longer locked behind a strict paywall. If you do have tokens, you can get Sparky, which is a nice little win. Still, ultimately, you know, everything's series 5 cards are expensive and blah blah blah. You get it, but it's a net gain here overall. I think some players will definitely be happy that they're not locked out completely if they don't want to buy the super premium pass. But anyway, Sparky here is a 2/1 with Activate. Give your card that last moved +3 power and move it back to its previous location. So this is first and foremost just, you know, a power buff. It's kind of a 4 power in total card, but it's also a move enabler, which we know how valuable an extra move can be, particularly if this hits something like Human Torch, you know, giving it +3 and moving it. That +3 is going to double on top of any of other stats that Torch has, you know, at a base that's already pushing him to 6 and then to 12 based on just Sparky alone. So move decks we know can really scale up power, particularly with Human Torch, but also just scale up based on moves. Hitting a dagger in extra time is still potentially, you know, an extra +4, +6 or whatever, and could make Sparky a rather efficient move tool, since you're getting kind of two sides of this. You know, we already know just moves can be really valuable. Compare this to like Ghost Spider, you know, it's 1 cost, it's a move. We love that. This is only 1 energy more, but you're also getting +3 power as a bonus. This movement aspect too is kind of interesting, that it moves back to its previous location instead of like Sparky's location. There's just some implications there about stuff like Madam Web, for instance. If you're moving a card from Madam Web, Sparky can move it back to Madam Web without like locking up the Madam Web location and kind of move things around. It's almost like he can be played independently anywhere. It doesn't really matter. And it still works the way you want it to work, basically. Unlike, say, something like Ghost Spider sometimes, which has some weird positioning implications. There is a timing demand on this because it's the last card that moved, but it doesn't say like the last card that moved, you know, last turn or anything. So you could kind of wait on this a while too and do some surprise stuff late. Maybe there's just, you know, some options there, but do keep in mind it is Activate, not on reveal, which, you know, can actually be a good thing. That could offer a lot of flexibility. If you play this on turn 2, you can save it up for turn 6 or whatever for that key moment. Alternatively, you know, if you draw this too late, like if you draw this and you want to play it on turn 6, you know, you can play a Ghost Spider on turn 6. You can't play a Sparky and get any utility out of it, at least on turn 6. So a little bit of a downside sometimes, but I actually think the Activate on average is an upside because it just lets you sequence things more favorably, and you can kind of play this down whenever and still time it for any future move card. Wait for that Human Torch to hit instead of wasting this on like a Vulture or whatever. Absolutely a possibility with a card like Sparky. So at the end of the day, what I'm saying is I think this is really good. I think the fact that it both moves and buffs is nice. It's not the highest base power level. The Activate's somewhat risky, but ultimately still a net positive. And I think that's going to make Sparky a great card for move decks. So next up here is Moira X. This is a 1/2 that reads, when this is destroyed, get a copy of your opening hand, which, you know, we've seen this kind of get a copy of your opening hand location before, which isn't typically exciting for the average deck. You know, most decks just like, well, I already played all those cards, right? You know, it's a bunch of like 5 drops. I can't do, what am I gonna do with 4 or 5 drops? You know, it just doesn't always pan out well for some decks. So not a card I expect to see showing up a lot. It also just has a destroy condition, so you're already kind of narrowing the field a little bit to a destroy deck package. But there are some interesting considerations here. You know, cards like Collector come to mind, and then cards like Victoria Hand come to mind, right? Victoria Hand in particular, just all of those cards get really nice buffs, and you might even get a copy of a Victoria Hand. And we know like stacking Victoria Hands can be crazy. So, you know, that's an angle. That deck also sometimes runs like Misery already. Now, Misery would not destroy Moira because Moira is not an on reveal, but, you know, you could maybe weave in a couple other destroy things in there and build this kind of destroy Victoria package with the hoods. And, you know, maybe instead of going for like a Frigga or something, you're just running like a Venom and a Carnage, and you're piecing together a deck out of that, essentially, instead of otherwise. You might have some other on reveals that are still really good to destroy for Moira and Victoria Hand as well, right? For created cards or whatever, Mirage or something. You could kind of start melding those two decks together. It's hard to say exactly how well that would turn out. How you know, it's just totally a new thing, right? I kind of think there's a lot there though, because like Victoria copies in particular are pretty crazy. So it makes me a little nervous. I will also note, you're going to want a deck that probably focuses on low cost cards, because, if you get, like I said, a bunch of 5-drops, you can't play them all, right? It's just too much stuff, too much energy to spend. So you'd have to have a pretty low curve. You wouldn't want a lot of fat stuff. So that's going to also restrict the decks that Moira can kind of fit into. But again, I don't think that's a problem necessarily for a Victoria hand Destroy hybrid. Maybe Misery's your most expensive card and you're just running little 1-drops and destroy stuff and just kind of go into town. There's also like hand filling applications here, stuff like maybe Kahori. We already talked about Collector. I mean, Double Dinosaur package in there could also be an angle for this, but again, you have to weave destroy into it. So it's just about building a hybrid out of that. I don't think most archetypes are going to be easily able to activate a destroy on this while also satisfying, the demand for this sort of payoff, like what's the hand doing in those scenarios. So ultimately what I'm getting at here is a pretty niche card. I think a really narrow range of decks could utilize this effectively, but I do think it's just such a big add to hand and can create some pretty cheesy lines that could scale some power crazy off stuff like Victoria Hand. That might be enough to make this card relevant, actually. We could see that kind of hybrid deck shining. It's just going to have a pretty tight window on that, finding success. You're going to have to really find a perfectly tight deck list to make it work, but I do think it's possible. So next up here actually is Bastion, and we're going to talk about a lot of similar things actually with Bastion. This is a 4/3, which did actually get a pretty substantial nerf since we last saw it in the Datamined version. I think it was a 4/5, which opens up an opportunity for this card, which maybe it was a buff. Maybe they were thinking the same thing I'm thinking now, which is that this could be in a Cerebro deck at 3 power. With this on reveal, add copies of your other cards here to your hand, set their costs to 2, and power to 3. So now everything's lining up at 3 power. You could basically play a Cerebro on turn 3, play a Bastion on turn 4, and copy a now 3 power Cerebro that only costs 2, and you're like, man, okay, that's an incredibly powerful sort of thing to do. You could actually also just go ahead and put a Mystique in there, play this on turn 5, get both of them, get a 1-drop in there, set it to 3. Well, I guess you can't have 3 things, you only get 2 things. So no, it does say other cards here. No, it can be 3 cards. Oh my god, yeah, you could do like 1-drop or 2-drop Cerebro, Mystique, play this, get all 3 of those added to hand as 2 3s, and just go to town right on all your 3 power stuff. So I don't know if Cerebro 3 is actually the reliable path forward for this, but it's actually another really good Victoria Hand card, I think. You can put a Victoria Hand down alongside whatever else. This is adding copies that are then going to get buffed by your Victoria Hand, and you're just going to potentially get another Victoria Hand as well, much like you might with Frigga. Frankly, you could do Victoria Hand on 2, Frigga on 3, Bastion on 4. On turn 5, you could actually play another Victoria Hand and Frigga 4/5. And then on turn 6, play those again. And you've got like chains of buffs, and each subsequent copy, of course, is also going to get buffed by all the Victoria Hands. Actually, some crazy lines, I think, are possible. Maybe that's why this got nerfed, because Victoria Hand cheese and chaining like that could get a hand. Now, that's kind of a perfect curve, but it doesn't matter. Like, any copies you're adding to hand are suddenly things that are going to get really nicely buffed by a Victoria Hand package. So, actually, a couple interesting angles for this. Other decks that are using this more honestly, I don't think this is good in just kind of like a tempo deck or whatever, copying your 3-drop and making it a 2/3 rarely is going to be kind of an awesome thing to do. There are, any other key cards that are like build-arounds. We talked about Cerebro. There's always stuff like Patriot, where you could go an extra Patriot or something and use that. But you got to realize, like, you're pretty quickly losing a lot of tempo by playing a 4/3. So the reward has to be worth the squeeze on this one. Most things, like, I don't think a Patriot would necessarily be worth it. Victoria Hand cheese might be worth it, because all of the cards you're copying suddenly become really valuable in those scenarios, because the fact that they're copies is the upside. So there are definitely some worlds where this could be worth it. I think a lot of other decks will just say, nah, I just don't have a need for this. Like, all that extra stuff's not worth it to me. It's also just a little bit clunky sometimes from a curve standpoint, although you can play 3 things on turn 6 for the record if they cost 2. But from like a turn 5, it's, if you play this on turn 4, turn 5 doesn't always line up well with 2 power thing or 2 cost thing. So ultimately, again, maybe fairly niche, but I think the home runs off this with Victoria and maybe even potentially Cerebro are so nutty. Like, the hits are so strong that it's potentially going to redefine what Victoria hand decks look like and could easily propel them to the top of the meta. All right, so next up here is Jim Hammond Human Torch. This is a 1/2. I kind of wonder if they changed the other torch to 3 so it wouldn't confuse people about them both being 1/2s. I don't know. Conspiracies. Anyway, this one reads, at the start of each turn, +1 power for each bonus energy that you have. Now, I want to be clear, bonus energy here is different than excess energy. We're going to actually see another card that cares about excess energy, or unspent energy, I guess it's called technically. Unspent energy is Sunspot, right? That's the same sort of thing as Sunspot. For Jim Hammond, we're talking about bonus energy. So for instance, if you play a Wiccan on turn 4, you get that +2 bonus energy. So on turn 5, you'd have +2 bonus. Jim Hammond would gain +2 power. You know, if you, again, on turn 6 after Wiccan, you get another +2 on Jim Hammond. So like Jim Hammond into Wiccan, that is already making this a 1/6. Any other, like, you know, locations, you play a Psylocke, Jennifer Kale, whatever. There's a few other ways, of course, to gain bonus energy. You could have an Arishem deck that you toss this into. All of those are going to be another little bonus on Jim Hammond's power here. So the question then becomes, like, is this worth running in a Wiccan deck as a 1/6? Is it worth running in an Arishem deck as a 1/6, I guess, again, for Arishem, I think? I'm not so sure it is, unfortunately. I really do like this a lot. Like, I like the idea of these, like, all-in energy decks. I'm, of course, going to try to build a deck that gets a Jillian bonus energy. We just got the Fallen one, of course, which can give us a ton of bonus energy as well. Like, you know, if you play that, like, Shuri combo we did where you get to 20 max energy or whatever, I think 21 on the final turn, that's 15 bonus energy. That could make your Jim Hammond, you know, a 117 in essence. Is that going to be good? You know, hard to say, but, you know, we're going to absolutely try it. It can go nuts. I think for more proven decks, stuff like Wiccan decks, for instance, I don't know if it's worth it. I think they care more about the consistency of the Wiccan. You just want to run that Quicksilver and be done with it and not have to worry about it. Running an extra 1-drop that's just maybe like +4 power probably isn't worth it for that deck, because, you know, they ultimately have a lot of other things they want to spend that energy on. And they have other, you know, just that slot in the deck has value, because you want to make sure you're able to play something impactful and meaningful, and a 1/6 might not be meaningful or impactful enough. Same thing for Arishem, right? It's like, well, it's fine, but would I just rather run a bigger card to use all that excess energy, that bonus energy for? So ultimately, I used excess energy again. Bonus energy, that's a confusing couple different angles here. So in essence, like, cool, it can get pretty big. Maybe there's a really all-in deck that utilizes this, but I think most of the decks that we know that already do bonus energy things probably really won't feel like making the room for Jim Hammond Human Torch. Just a kind of honest 1-drop like this doesn't feel like it's cheesy enough or swingy enough or even reliable enough, because, you know, drawing this too late, you know, if you draw this late, it doesn't gain it after the fact. It has to already be on board. All of those are issues that I think do probably hold this card back a little too much. All right, moving on here to Warlock, a character I'm actually super pumped to see in Marvel Snap. I had an action figure of this guy when I was a kid, I guess from like the X-Men animated series or something, but I always just loved that toy, and I love this this character. So pretty pumped to see him. He is a 3/3 with Activate. For each unspent energy, give a card in your hand -1 cost. Now this is unspent energy, not bonus energy, so we're talking about like Sunspot basically equivalent here, where you're going to want to float some energy on a given turn, because this is Activate. It's not turn after turn, but you're going to set a moment where you hit this Activate. So probably you're going to like skip turn 5, for instance. You're going to hopefully buff your Sunspot by 5. Maybe this isn't a High Evo deck, because High Evo already cares about unspent energy. So your Cyclops is going to go off, your Misty Knight's going to go off, whatever, right? Your Bruce Banner turns into the Hulk, and you discount your hand by 5. And your She-Hulk now costs 5 less. It's such a crazy potential swing. Like, those 5 discounts, you know, are so unpredictable. The asymmetrical informational advantage here, where you know what you can do on the turn, you know how you can shift your power around, you know you got like crazy discounts here. The opponent can't expect exactly what you're going to do or where you're going to go, because suddenly all the numbers are just unpredictable. They just have no idea what got discounted by what. And it's like, okay, do they have a She-Hulk or not? Is there Infinite 4 energy now? And like, what can they do with that Infinite, right? How big's the Sunspot going to get after all this? There's just no way for them to know, and you have all that information, so it makes you so much smarter on that final turn. I think it's actually crazy that this gives you such significant discounts. It's almost like a 3 cost Sarah or something in a way too, where it's like, you know, you're kind of skipping turn 5, so it's, you know, kind of 8 cost in a way, but you're just getting all of that energy back on your discounts, and you're fueling all the other things that your deck probably wants to do anyway. You're already doing that in these She-Hulk decks. And then of course Magic, you could do it on turn 6 or even more, going into turn 7. Yeah, so I don't know. Maybe again a pretty niche card. Maybe it's really just like High Evo. Might be hard to utilize this elsewhere all that effectively. Although I do wonder if you could just like play this in any deck and just skip turn 5, and that it makes you so unpredictable that it's like still worth it. Or maybe like a Wiccan deck, you play this on 3, Wiccan on 4. You know, skip 7. Like you could have some crazy pop-offs there. So we could see more of a like dedicated Warlock package there that moves away from High Evo. Maybe it's Warlock Wiccan even. But I also think High Evo, very natural, obvious for the fit for this too. So ultimately, I think this is just so nice of an effect that this is definitely going to see some play. Might even ultimately feel a little broken, I think. Next up here is Jocosta. This is a 3/3 with activate. Immediately activate your other cards here without using up their activate abilities, which of course we're getting a lot more activate cards. Literally, you know, well, there is one. Yes, there is one, but we've already, of course, seen 1, 2, I guess already, right? So activate is getting a lot more support than it used to have, I guess is what I'm getting at. You know, you printed this even 3-4 months ago, I would have said, man, there's just nothing to do with this. Nowadays, it does feel like there's a lot more potential here, and certainly some activate abilities are pretty valuable. I mean, just my favorite example is like Scarlet Spider, right? My favorite, probably long-time activate card. This, in essence, is a 3/3 that would then make you a 5-power Scarlet Spider clone. You know, that makes this a 3/8 right off the bat. Nothing else. This is just a 3/8 in total output, right? 5 and 3. So like, I'm already kind of sold sometimes, right? If my deck's just running enough activate stuff, like this does a lot. Not to mention, you know, that's not the only activate you're going to have in a given spot. You might have 1 or 2 other activates as a bonus. You can actually get a lot of output out of this pretty quickly. Then, of course, the elephant in the room perhaps is Invisible Woman First Steps. We know that activate can be crazy with end of turn decks. You could also obviously play it with Prodigy. You could maybe even do a weird thing where you had all 3 of those in a given location. That's sometimes hard to orchestrate, but not impossible, for just like the most insane activate, like end of turn or whatever, where you're doing that, you know, multiple times in a given turn. Like, I forget it, right? Like the chains there just off the chain, if you will. Like, it's just so much ridiculous possible output on that. I think if all that works, which it should all work, right? Because yeah, you just activate this first, and then you still activate the other ones after, and you just go completely nuts, right? So. Listen, again, a card I think could be absolutely nuts. End of turn is the first most obvious example, but I don't even think it's limited there. I think there's just a lot of ways to make this pretty good. It could be an all-in activate deck, frankly. Might be just fine, but that's not the only thing. I think this just can snowball out of control really, really quickly and seems quite powerful to me. So next up here is Awesome Andy, which I know nothing about this character, but I kind of love him already. He is a 2/1 with activate. Give 1 of your cards at each other location plus 2 power. So in total, this is, you know, a 2/5 in total output, which, you know, I think that's totally fine. There are some cards, of course, which can benefit additionally from on-board power gaining, stuff like, you know, Sebastian Shaw, classic example, where him getting buffed on board is still really a nice little bonus that scales it additionally. You know, some other cards care more about like in hand buffing, like Brood or whatever, or that's, you know, works with preemptive buffing like Forge, but you know, this is no good on a Brood, but still has some targets like Shaw, etc., that are a bonus. Scarlet Spider is another good example, of course. But, you know, it is just a random card at each other location, so you might have to do some smart positioning or planning there in order to line this up on key targets. That said, I actually don't think this is bad. I think this is kind of fine. You know, play it down on 2. The activate lets you set it up for later, so you can develop the Shaw on 3, the Scarlet Spider on 4. Then maybe, I don't know, you even go in with a Namora on 5 or whatever, right, and buff them again. There are some things you can do with this. So, look, do I think this is going to be like a staple that's, you know, showing up in all kinds of decks or whatever as a 2-drop? No, I think this is really competitive, high-tempo 2-drops, even for buff decks and stuff, where this probably doesn't make the cut. Is this a card I think you could pick up and probably just toss in a lot of decks and be totally fine using your new card, having some fun with it? Yeah, for sure. I think this is that kind of card. Like, I don't think this would hurt, and any kind of buff deck in particular could probably run this over alternative. So if you like pick this up at an event or whatever, I don't know how it's coming out, like, yeah, I think you'd probably be able to use this fine. In other words, nothing crazy here, but pretty solid card nonetheless. So next up is Omega Sentinel. This is a 4/3 with Activate. Again, another pretty darn nice Activate effect for our 3-drop there. Afflict the highest power enemy card with -7 power. And I kind of call this like a, you know, an Activate Shang-Chi in a way, because, you know, Shang-Chi is about killing all that big stuff. Omega Sentinel doesn't kill it, but she can still debuff it in a pretty significant way, and ultimately, you know, is a 10-point swing on board, +3, -7. And a nice bonus over something like Shang-Chi, of course, is that she can hit anything. If your opponent's highest power card is a 5 power card, like, this is still really useful, and it's still really swingy, pushing it down in that way, unlike Shang-Chi, which can totally just whiff. The Activate here is also sometimes a nice bonus because, you know, you don't have to like time it like a Shang-Chi, you know. Sometimes you have to both predict and time your Shang-Chi in a really compelling way. With this, you just plop it down. If there's ever anything there, it's going to work. Admittedly, you know, your opponent can kind of play around it to some extent if they haven't already committed a card, but my God, like, okay, then you just win the location for free or whatever, right? That's fine. Priority could shift that. If you had priority going into 6, you know, they could dodge it all together, but the same is true of Shang-Chi, right? So, you know, this is almost like a lower ceiling than Shang-Chi, because, you know, this is not very good against an Infinite, unlike Shang-Chi, but it's a higher floor Shang-Chi in a way. In other words, it always kind of works, right? Shang-Chi can really whiff. It can really have a low floor. And I don't hate that. You know, the surprise factor of Shang-Chi is also valuable, which this doesn't have, because you can't play it on turn 6 and still activate it, obviously. I guess you kind of can actually with Jocosta now, because you could play it and then hit the activate on Jocosta, but maybe not the best combo possible. So, you know, from a cube standpoint, maybe not as good, but just from like an honest, reliable standpoint, I do think this is another fine alternative in that kind of world. There's also, of course, just affliction synergies. Now, I think most affliction decks do value going a little bit wider with the afflictions. You know, Man-Thing, for instance, might be better than Omega Sentinel in an affliction deck for a 4-cost card, because it can affect multiple things, which, you know, makes your Ajax bigger, makes your Diamondback better, etc. But that is obviously another possible path here too, where you're just going for you know, an affliction deck and need more bodies to work with. So I think this is another pretty solid card, actually. I think just the net swing on points here is worth it, and it's pretty high consistency, both of which make it pretty playable. Maybe it even goes in a C3 deck, by the way. That's kind of fun. So next up here we have Super Adaptoid, who is evil green Captain America robot. Look, that's probably correct. I don't know. He's a 3/5 on reveal. Steal the text from an enemy activate card here. Obviously, we just saw all these millions of activate cards. We've got other staples like Invisible Woman First Steps right now, where you not only get to remove that from your opponent, but also potentially, because you're stealing that activate, you also get to use it yourself, I guess. Kind of like a rogue, except this is for activate instead of ongoing. Which, you know, obviously can be really swingy if you hit the right stuff. You know, you hit their Omega Sentinel, right? That is an enormous potential swing. So, like, you're basically stealing, you know, 7 power of upside from them and netting 7 power of upside yourself. It's like a 14-point swing, basically, if you can steal the Omega Sentinel. So, you know, some stuff like Invisible Woman First Steps, you might not have a way to realize the bonus. Other times, you know, you might actually also get to realize the bonus of using that activate. I'll also say from a timing standpoint, that does, you know, often mean you're going to want to play this before turn 6, I guess, assuming you want to utilize that stolen activate text. I don't think that's going to be a huge problem necessarily, though, and it still, in a pinch, could be useful post turn 6. So, in a way, this is kind of like a super rogue, and I mean, rogue's a pretty solid card. We see tossed into a lot of different control decks here and there. This is a higher base power. I will say, you know, I think activate, certainly so far at least, has been way less common than ongoing for rogue. Like, there's been a lot of great metas where rogue is hit. Will this hit as consistently? Probably not, but it's also just better to baseline, so it might have some more flexibility. So in other words, this looks like a pretty good tech card in the scheme of tech cards as far as I can tell. So then our final card here is Danger, and this character looks 6 because it looks like a Warlock type character, and I love Warlocks, so now I love Danger as well. It's a 4/6, activate, destroy an enemy card here with less power. So another activate potentially for Jocosta. You can really see that activate deck kind of coming together, man. That could be really cool. Also just a nice little swing card of sorts. You know, this could easily be an 11 power play if it hits a 5 power target. Now do keep in mind it's not like targeting the highest power card or anything like that, so it also could hit like a 1 power squirrel and only be a 4/7, so some kind of risk there that, you know, just sort of low rolls on its target. It does also though scale nicely with power buffs. If you play this in a buff deck, you know, push this up to 410 or something, that does raise that ceiling a little bit on targets, but ultimately is still also kind of susceptible to a squirrel being next to the big target. So it's pretty inconsistent and iffy. I'll also say from an activate standpoint, you're giving your opponent a lot of influence over these results, because you play this down, they see it and they go, oh, okay, well, Danger's there, that's kind of scary. I'm just gonna stuff that location with my bad stuff. And I'm gonna put an extra little 1-drop in there so that Danger has a chance to low roll in those cases. Which does give you kind of Danger Room vibes. I feel like, is she connected to Danger Room? I don't know the lore, guys, but maybe. So in essence, like, you know, not a bad total swing power output. Like worst case, very often, well, worst case, I guess a 4/6, but in many cases 4/7, 4/8, 4/9, I think is the range you'll expect to hit, which is not bad for a 4-drop. If you have other activate synergies, might feel more worth it, but might also be restricted to that world, because a lot of decks won't want to rely on the inconsistency here. They'll want something they know works for them. Particularly buff decks, you know, are often spending that 4-cost turn on Galacta or Gwynpool, not on a Danger. You know, and I would actually probably prefer a Scarlet Spider if I'm looking for a rewarding buff card over a Danger, because I can kind of trust the results. Whereas this one is just left up to fate, and I don't know if that's a great thing to do. And, you know, left up to your opponent's decision making as well with the activate. They get to see it ahead of time. So for all those reasons, I do think Danger's probably going to struggle a little bit. All right, so all that said, let's now rate each of these cards from 1 to 4 stars, but also starting from the best and going to the worst. Viv Vision is a 4-star card. Jocosta is a 4-star card. Bastion is a 4-star card. Warlock is a 4-star card. Sparky is a 3-star card. Moira X is a 3-star card. Omega Sentinel is a 3-star card. Super Adaptoid is a 3-star card. Awesome Andy is a 2-star card. Jim Hammond Human Torch is a 2-star card. Danger is a 2-star card. And there you go, folks. That's all the new cards in this season. Honestly, some big hitters. That's a lot of 4-star cards. I think more than we maybe have ever given. I don't know. Does that make this month really strong? Am I overthinking some of the overrating some of these? Maybe underthinking some of these. I don't know, man. I see some big hitters. Jocosta looks crazy scary. I think Viv Vision could go in so many decks. I think Bastion makes Victoria Hand really spooky, and that's already a really good package. So I think Warlock's actually kind of nuts as well. Yeah, dude, all of those seem like legit 4-star cards to me if I'm thinking about it. So yeah, it seems like it actually could be a strong month. I guess we'll see. We'll see as always how it goes. But thanks much for watching. Appreciate your time. Share these thoughts down below, and I guess I will see you around.